The United Kingdom used to be a world leader, and it's rapidly descending into semi-third world status. And this is not because there's something inevitable about decline. The country is in a pitiful condition because it has been run for 30 years by essentially the same sort of people.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, former MP Douglas Carswell on his plan to restore Britain.
Reality is catching up, and it's pretty grim. It's why there is a mood of real pessimism in the country. It's why people are voting for an alternative, because they realise that there is something profoundly wrong with the system.
Douglas talks about taking control of the machinery of state and reducing public spending.
Think of the waste, the gazillions of pounds of waste that must be happening within the British state today, because no one's really in charge, no one really audits it, no one really signs off on it. Parliament's been asleep at the wheel for a generation or two. The Treasury's dysfunctional, Downing Street's useless. All of this money is being spent dysfunctionally. Think of how much we could save if we started to rein in the spending of the British state.
And says mass immigration is putting Britain in danger of losing its own identity.
I already find, as someone who was born in London, parts of the city of my birth unrecognisable. And I believe that Britain should primarily be a place of British culture. England should primarily be a place of English culture. That's not to say that others can't live here, but the primary culture must be England.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Douglas Carswell, former Member of Parliament, who now runs a free market think tank in Mississippi. Douglas, welcome.
Lee, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So you recently published 9 Steps to Restore Britain, which was kind of a strategic plan for how you think that can be done. Before we dive into the details, I wanted to ask you why you wrote it.
Britain is in a pitiful condition, and as a Brit living 4,500 miles away in the southern United States, I despair at the state of the old country. The United Kingdom used to be a world leader, and it's rapidly descending into semi-third world status. And this is not because there's something inevitable about decline. The country is in a pitiful condition because it has been run for 30 years by essentially the same sort of people. What I call in the essay Milestones, the Blairite ascendancy. We've had, almost 28 years ago to the day, Tony Blair was elected. For the first 10 years of that, he was Prime Minister, and then he handed on to what were in effect a succession of Blairite governments. And they have run the country, and they have run it into the ground. And I wanted to set out the problem, and I wanted to then, instead of just making a list of policies, I wanted to produce a strategy. How do you turn the growing public dissatisfaction with the state of the country into a cause for change that will fix it? It can be done, but boy, does it need to be done.
You talk about the catastrophic decline of Britain. What do you see as the key features of that?
I mean, some of the ways of gauging this are economic.
Yeah.
There's been a stagnation in living standards, if not an actual decline in per capita incomes over the past, really, nearly 20 years now. Since 2007, 2008, there's been no significant per capita GDP growth in the country. Productivity has declined. But it's not just economic problems. Britain faces far more than an economic malaise. We have a demographic problem and a immigration problem and a cultural cohesion problem. Margaret Thatcher in the late 1970s had to address and rescue Britain from economic decline. In a way, the condition of Britain is far worse now. We don't just have an economic problem, we have a demographic and a cultural problem. You've had mass immigration, and this has brought into the country a large number of people who are not British and who will never become British, and many of whom do not want to become British. And contrary to all of the assumptions that the globalist elite had, which is that people wanted to become Western, we now have a large number of non-Western people living in the West in Britain who don't want to become Western. How do you address this? It's an existential issue for a country like Britain to address.
Diving into your plan now, the first milestone is about the machinery of state, how you would take control of it and probably slim it down a bit as well. Can you talk us through that?
I would say if you're an American watching this, your country, irrespective of how people vote in elections, your country is structured in such a way so that someone somewhere, it may be a governor, it may be a lieutenant governor, it may be a state government, someone somewhere will be doing the right thing. Britain's system of government is set up in a way so that even when people vote overwhelmingly for the right choices and elect a government to control the borders, lower taxes, do all the right things, the system of government is set up so that never happens. You never get that outcome. So in order to correct the problem, you need to recognise that the British state itself is decrepit and dysfunctional. It is run by a third-rate civil service and a fourth-rate judiciary who are intentionally stopping the sorts of changes that need to happen. So it's not enough for Britain to have a change of government. Boy, we've had enough changes of government in the past decade. We don't need to change just the government. We need to change how the country is governed. And that requires us fundamentally changing the administrative state. So we have 24 government departments. In America, they talk about the administrative state. We have 24 of these departments. I propose that on day one, you get rid of 8 of them, like the president of Argentina did so successfully in Buenos Aires. You need to create a department of the Prime Minister. At the moment, you have a ramshackle structure. I won't bore you with the details, but basically 3 different departments supposedly at the steering wheel, and that's why we always end up in the ditch, because you need a single unified department of the Prime Minister. You need what are known as orders in council. In America, we all know that Trump, when he came to office, very effectively used executive orders. This had been carefully thought through and choreographed so that the moment he entered the Oval Office, he was delivering on the things he said he was going to deliver, and that had been thought through and choreographed very effectively. The British state allows you to do something similar. They're not executive orders, they're called orders in council. And they allow you to establish control over the civil service, to cap the number of immigrants coming in, to fast-track deportations, to do all of these things under these special powers that the Prime Minister has.
Can I just ask how the Prime Minister can sign those off by himself?
It would actually need to be the King who signs off on it. It's a way of exercising the so-called Crown prerogative powers. These are the residual powers that the monarch still has, but the Prime Minister exercises on behalf of the monarch. It's unconventional. It's very unconventional. But boy, we're in such an unconventional mess. We need unconventional methods to get out of it. It's conventional approaches that have left us in this sorry state. So I think we can deliver on these changes, but it's going to require this extra executive action and emergency legislation. Margaret Thatcher recognised that the condition of the country would never improve in the 1980s until she took on and destroyed the National Union of Miners. They were essentially parasitic vested interest holding the country back. We need to recognise that the so-called mandarinate, the bureaucratic state, the administrative state, and the leftist judges sitting on the Supreme Court are like the National Union of Mine Workers. They need to be taken on and they need to be destroyed in order for the country to control its borders. We cannot control who comes into the country because civil servants and judges prevent us from doing so. We cannot rein in public spending because the administrative state prevents us from doing so. We've seen in America how this year federal spending has fallen by 5% in a single year as a consequence of Elon Musk's Doge Commission. Think of the waste, the gazillions of pounds of waste that must be happening within the British state today, because no one's really in charge, no one really audits it, no one really signs off on it. Parliament's been asleep at the wheel for a generation or two. The Treasury's dysfunctional. Downing Street's useless. All of this money is being spent dysfunctionally. Think of how much we could save if we started to rein in the spending of the British state. So we have it within us to fix this country's problems. And I wrote Milestones because I was deeply frustrated. Looking at it from 4,000 miles away, I couldn't see anyone else coming up with a strategy. So I thought, I'm going to spend a few weekends here in Mississippi doing it as a side hustle. And I've been really pleasantly surprised by the reaction. I mean, boy, have a lot of people got in touch. It's why I came over here to talk about it at more length with a new generation of MPs who do want to see some of these changes, and I hope I can help them do it.
So your second point is about our borders as one of the big issues of our time. How would you secure them?
I mean, first of all, you've got to turn off the taps. At the moment, you know, 1 in every 27 people in Britain today has arrived in the country in the past 2 years. I've not been in the UK for 4 years now, apart from a fleeting visit, and I, just walking around London, notice it. I was in a part of London that I grew up in, and I noticed that there were more people wearing hijabs than baseball caps. It's a profound and fundamental, dramatic demographic change happening in real time. We need to stop the mass immigration of people, and that means capping visas, making sure that people from certain countries simply aren't allowed to come in, because we all know that if people come in from countries like Pakistan and other countries like that, they generally just stay and nothing happens. So cap the visas, fast-track deportation. When people are being deported at the moment, they can draw out the process endlessly. So remove them from the country to a third country and have that appeal heard in that third country. If you're a genuine refugee or you've got a genuine case as to why you should be allowed to stay, you're not going to mind too much about having to spend a few months living in a hotel in a third party country in order to do that. Then I think we need a program of voluntary migration. Sweden has started doing this. Sweden has an even worse demographic problem than we do, and it is paying people roughly 20,000 euros to voluntarily return back to the country of their origin. That's a useful start, and we need to do that, but we also then need 2 forms of involuntary remigration, deportation. Now, some people will say that this is all wrong, that immigration is a source of good. And you know, I'm an immigrant to America. I welcome immigration when it works. When you move from one country to another and you want to contribute to that country and you want to make a positive contribution to that country and you want to assimilate to that country, that is fantastic. That is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But the data that we see coming from Europe, particularly from Denmark and the Netherlands, clearly shows that this isn't the case. Not every immigrant is an Elon Musk. Not every immigrant. In fact, the data from the Netherlands clearly shows that immigrants from Britain and America are generally overwhelming net contributors to the public finances of the Netherlands. They pay more in taxes than they take from the system. Immigrants from East Asia and from the rest of Europe are also pretty positive contributors. Countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, they make a net positive contribution. Particularly people from Singapore, actually, very, very good for an economy to have Singaporeans living in your country.
You see it with Hong Kongers as well. They seem to make such a contribution.
But if you look at the data from the Netherlands, at migrants from Muslim countries and from North Africa, at no point during their careers, and it's a bit of a stretch of the term career to suggest some of these people have careers, at no point during their working lives, not all of them are working, part of the problem, do they make a net contribution to the Dutch exchequer. At every stage, they are a net burden. People from countries like Somalia cost a huge amount. I mean, you're talking about, you know, over €1 million net burden on the system. So why are we told that immigration from different countries is a good thing when clearly the data shows that it can be good, it can be bad? So we need an immigration policy that restricts immigration from countries that don't make a contribution and allows it from countries that do make a contribution. And then, of course, we need to deal with the elephant in the room, which no one wants to talk about, but I'm happy to talk about because I live in a free republic under the protections of the First Amendment. We need to talk about Islam and Muslim integration. The idea of the melting pot doesn't work if parts of the melting pot don't want to melt. And clearly, I think there are some people who want to live under Sharia law, and they want to live in a way that is incompatible with living in the West. And so I think we need legislation that allows people to have citizenship removed from them if they advocate for things that are incompatible with living in a Western civilized country, and they then need to be removed from the country. I don't think we should hold back on doing this. If I was to go to a country in East Asia or a country in South Asia, or a country pretty much anywhere around the world, and advocate for things that were offensive and inconsistent, I suspect I would probably be removed from that country fairly short. We shouldn't hold back in doing this. So I set out how to do this, how to do it in a clearly defined, sensible, strategic way. I think it has to happen. If it doesn't happen, then Britain and much of Western Europe will become unrecognisable. I already find, as someone who was born in London, parts of the city of my birth unrecognisable. And I believe that Britain should primarily be a place of British culture. England should primarily be a place of English culture. That's not to say that others can't live here, but the primary culture must be England. And London is the capital of England. And I think we should seek to make sure that it remains the capital of England. And we should be prepared to take the steps necessary to do that.
One issue you've already referred to that seems to be a bit of an obstacle for immigration, things happening, is this judicial activism. Yeah, how would you deal with that?
You've got an absurd situation in Britain at the moment where often the tribunal judges who adjudicate on a case will be people who have a clear personal preference for mass uncontrolled immigration. There's been a series of recent cases where some fairly outrageous examples where people have been allowed to remain in the country. In one case, I think it was someone wasn't deported to Albania because they argued that their son liked the fried chicken in England. I mean, ridiculous cases. Clearly, for the system to work and the public to have faith in it, the judges need to be able to interpret the law as it is, not as they wish it to be, and they need to be impartial, and that's clearly not the case. So I think we need to sack a lot of the tribunal judges. There will be at every level in the judiciary an attempt to prevent deportation. Yeah. Throughout my entire adult life, I've never once heard a judge intervene and insist that the British state apply the law by removing someone from the country. They only ever apply the law to insist that someone is not removed. So clearly we need to not just make sure that the law is absolutely clear, we need to make sure that we have judges, and that means reviewing the process for removing judges. It means overhauling the system for judicial appointments. You've got a dreadful organisation called the Judicial Appointments Commission. It has no democratic legitimacy. It should, I think, be the most reviled and despised institution within the British state, and there's a lot of pretty stiff competition. It is the root cause of the problem. But, you know, some of your listeners might say, the judges are only ruling on what the law is. We just need better law. I mean, that is clearly not the case. We have now a huge body of case evidence showing that judges are acting as activists in favour of uncontrolled immigration. I mean, think about it this way. More immigrants have illegally crossed the English Channel in small boats in the past few years than British, Canadian and American troops landed on D-Day during the invasion of France. What country in its right mind would allow that mass invasion of its space and not apply the laws? Either you have border controls or you cease to be a country. You just become a space in which anyone can come. And I think once you begin to see it in those terms, clearly there is something fundamentally wrong with the judiciary. From the lowly activist judge at a tribunal right through to the Supreme Court. The whole judicial edifice is rotten. It's fundamentally a system created by people who have elevated the notion of the rule of law to meaning the rule of lawyers. And that's the root cause of the problem. We need a restoration of the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. So that there will be a conflict and a coming collision with the Supreme Court. But bring it on. If it's over immigration, I think the Supreme Court will lose, and deservedly so. If they want to behave like the Bourbons, let's treat them like the Bourbons.
So your third milestone refers to some of these laws that probably had a different purpose when they were launched, but are being used now to catastrophic consequences. And can you talk us through what they are and what you would do with them?
In a normal democracy, when a government comes in and introduces laws, if they're not working, the other lot get in and they correct them or repeal them. That's why democracy tends to work. It's a cumulative process. There's no finality to it. Unfortunately, the Blairite administrations that we've had over the past few years have introduced 3 or 4 key bills that no subsequent government has had the desire to overturn. One of them is the Equalities Act. The Equalities Act defines Britons not as individuals equal under the law, but extends preferential treatment for people with protected characteristics. It creates literally an inverted system of apartheid. It makes people in Britain unequal on the basis of their immutable characteristics. It is the precise opposite of equality.
Yeah.
That has profound implications. The Human Rights Act incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law, which allows judges to adjudicate on the basis of what they want public policy to be. The Climate Change Act allows a group of officials unaccountable to the public to determine basically whether or not Britain's economy is globally viable by determining whether or not we can produce energy at a cost that allows us to be competitive in the global economy. So you've got these, the Equalities Act, the Human Rights Act, the Climate Change Act. I would say there's a fourth one, which is the Communications Act. I can't remember that. I think it may be section 127. It basically gives the British state the ability to arrest and detain people because they say things that some people might find offensive. Now, I hope that much of what I've said today, some people will find offensive. In a free country, you need people to be able to say things that are offensive. That's how you root out inconsistencies and reach the truth, by allowing people to speak freely. So these what you might call sort of fundamental Blairite laws need to be repealed in order for the country to prosper and to thrive. It's, I think, the great shame of David Cameron's administration that he did nothing to repeal human rights legislation or the Equalities Act. There are other bits of legislation that might need to be repealed, but those are the key ones.
So why, you gave David Cameron as an example, why do they not get repealed? Why do people just keep going along with these laws that obviously aren't doing what they were supposed to do?
I think because David Cameron, who once described himself as the heir to Blair, the successor of Tony Blair, they were all essentially Blairite. And by that I mean they didn't just admire Tony Blair, they shared 3 fundamental assumptions. Tony Blair and every government that followed him, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, all of them shared the same 3 core assumptions. Number one, they believed in the infallibility of the expert. When Tony Blair got in, he gave control of setting interest rates to the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. Bookend that to the other end of the Blairite administrations, Boris Johnson, during COVID, gave a group of technocrats the ability to decide whether or not Britain should be put under house arrest because of an outbreak of seasonal flu. Throughout the Blairite administrations, they all believed that experts could make better public policy. The second consistency they all had was a belief that economic growth in Britain could be created not by reducing red tape and deregulation and by lowering taxes, but by monetary stimulus. So what they did is they raised taxes and they raised regulation, and to offset the drag effect that had on economic velocity and economic growth, they used monetary stimulus.
So is this the quantitative easing?
Low interest rates and quantitative easing.
Right.
And it's like a sugar rush. It gives you initially a burst of energy economically, but it's candy floss growth. And we have bankrupted the country by doing this. It's not real growth, it's artificial growth, it's stimulated growth. It's a bit like an athlete taking steroids. You'll be the top sprinter for a while, but then your heart will pack in. It's not a great way of running an economy. So they believed in the infallibility of experts, they believed in candy floss credit to stimulate economic growth, monetary stimulus to generate economic growth. And the third thing they all had in common is they believed that human nature is universal. They believe that people are interchangeable. At the most extreme version, they literally ended up believing that a man could become a woman by declaring himself a woman. They believe that an Eritrean can become English by virtue of being given a British passport. Now, I think most people listening to this know that human nature is not universal. Not everyone wants the same thing. Time preferences are different in different societies. There's a reason why if you walk down the street in Taipei, it will be a very different visual and oratory experience to walking down the street in Rio de Janeiro. And that is a reflection of different preferences amongst the population who lives there. The idea that people are interchangeable is why they opened up the borders to mass immigration. It's why they ultimately ended up in the absurd situation of allowing male cheats to win at women's sports. It's also, incidentally, why the Blairite governments had a foreign policy based on the idea that they could westernize or globalize parts of the world through a process of invasion and what they called nation building. We know from what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan that human nature is not universal. And we're seeing on the streets of Britain, where you've imported large numbers of people from countries like that human nature is not interchangeable. So these are the three fundamental fallacies of the governments of Britain over the past 30 years. And it's kind of the cuckoos have come home to roost. I may be mixing my metaphors slightly, but reality is catching up, and it's pretty grim. It's why there is a mood of real pessimism in the country. It's why people are voting for an alternative, because they realize that there is something profoundly wrong with the system, and they want an alternative, and they're not getting it. And so what for so long has been dismissed as populism is actually a pretty fair assessment about the administrative class in Britain who have done so much to reduce the country to this pitiful condition.
One crucial issue you've touched on as your fourth milestone is growth, the need for economic growth. How would you stimulate that?
Well, number one, don't try and generate growth by getting the Bank of England to print lots of money. It doesn't work. It might work in the short term, but what you need to do is remove a lot of the restrictions on things like planning. I was talking to somebody in her 20s today who was talking to me knowing that she would never be able to buy a property in London. This is because we've restricted where you can build housing, we've restricted housing development to the point where young British people cannot afford to buy a house. So one of the first things we need to do, which would help, is to remove a lot of the restrictions, particularly the environmental regulations on planning developments. Get rid of them. There is a bridge here across the River Thames that was built by the Victorians called Hammersmith Bridge. It's a testament to the engineering marvels of the British in the 19th century. Unfortunately, it's old now and there are cracks in it, and so they had to close it. It has been closed for 8 years. For 8 years, no one has been able to get the permits and the permission to build a bridge across the Thames that the Victorians were able to build in a few months over a century ago. That is a metaphor for the condition of the country. We need to remove the restrictions and allow people to build not just bridges across the Thames, but housing and developments. Get rid of the red tape, get rid of the restrictions. When we left the European Union, we inherited many thousands of restrictions. The data protection restrictions, that are known as GDPR, the restrictions on clinical trials, the Clinical Trials Directive. We need to go through carefully, it will probably take 6 months or so, go through carefully and decide which ones of those to rescind. Now, some of them we might want to keep, but an awful lot of them we can simply get rid of. We voted to leave the European Union because we didn't like being regulated. Why have we kept the regulations? Get rid of a lot of those regulations. Simply undoing the GDPR data protection regulations would do a huge amount to allow small and medium-sized businesses to use digital marketing. If you go to other parts of the world, if you go to East Asia, or if you go to America, you'll quite often notice that people use technology, digital technology, far more and far better in many ways. And one of the reasons for this is because there simply aren't these insane restrictions on how you use email lists, for example. So, yeah, a process of deregulation.
Public spending is now a whopping, I think we can call it 45% of GDP. I mean, how would you get that figure down, and in what ways would you reform the public sector?
It's going to be difficult because once you increase public spending, you create a constituent of vested interests who will squeal when you begin to reduce public spending. So you need to be specific. You mustn't just say we must reduce public spending. You need to set out how, and I do that in Milestones. I go into a great deal of detail. In a 5-year Parliament, we should first aim to reduce public spending back to the level that it was before COVID. Ultimately, we need to get it down to about 33-35%. I think to be a successful economy, you cannot have public spending at more than 33-35%. You're not going to get there in one term. So the first term should aim to take it down from 45% to about 40%. That can be done by a series of changes. Number one, you could reduce the total number of government departments from 24 to, you could reduce it by 8. I've costed that carefully. That would give you a saving of about 30 billion. There are things like reducing the foreign aid budget. Sadly, that's 15 billion. That's say you reduce that by 13 billion. That's not going to allow you to close the gap, but it will go some way towards that. You fundamentally need to remove welfare payments from an awful lot of people in Britain who are claiming benefits because they don't wish to work. One of the consequences of the COVID lockdowns was to create a culture of not working. The number of people claiming disability benefit in Britain is higher now than it's ever been, and yet the overall health of the population today is higher than it has ever been. People are often claiming disability benefit, and I speak as someone who was a constituency member of Parliament and dealt with a lot of these cases firsthand. A lot of people claiming disability benefits are capable of working and should not be getting them. And we have to spell that out. We have to address the problem. We have to stop some of those payments. We have something in Britain called universal credit, and it's a benefit system, and it has been a disaster. So we need to confront the issue. We cannot be a viable, successful country. Our children and our children's children will not be more prosperous than we are if we continue to create a welfare system, a welfare benefit system that allows people to subsist on a diet of video games and pizza rather than going out and living a purposeful life.
One of the big areas of our spending is the NHS. So what do you think can be done there?
I'm fully in favour of reform, some pretty radical reform, but the idea, I mean, I think the golden rule of public sector reform is that reform doesn't save you money. So the purpose of reform should be to make sure you get more bang for your buck, not that you reduce the amount of buck. There are some fairly obvious things. At the moment, the doctor lobbies to restrict the number of British doctors trained every year because they obviously want to reduce the number of people in their profession because it for obvious reasons. Since guilds in the Middle Ages, professions have always tried to restrict the number of people who get certified as professionals. So remove that. One of the consequences of limiting the number of people in Britain who can train as doctors every year is to import often third-rate doctors from third world countries who frankly just aren't very good. Some are, but many, many aren't. So remove the cap on the number of doctors. Fundamentally, though, I think you need to look at countries like Singapore. They have a system of personal health care accounts for primary care. This is I don't think you can. I think you need insurance for complex and chronic medical problems, but for day-to-day primary medical care, I think you should set up a Singaporean type system. Now, people have often said the NHS is sacrosanct. You can't talk about reforming it. You just have to keep on giving it money. Well, I think we've now got to the stage where if you're not willing to reform the NHS, you're not really going to be able to control the public finances. You're not really going to be able to improve productivity. One of the reasons why productivity in the country is so bad is because so much money goes into the NHS, and you've had actually declining productivity in the NHS. It's a luxury to pretend that it's too complicated and you can't address it. You have to begin to reform the NHS. Now, really interestingly, the Labour Party, which has often been the party that is most in favour of the status quo with the NHS, is actually beginning to implement some of these changes. It's very interesting. One of the few non-hopeless ministers in the Labour government is a man called Wes Streeting, and he's actually beginning to introduce some of the changes, abolishing some of the bureaucracy that presides over the NHS. I suspect you will begin to see standardised procedures like hip operations contracted out for private companies to actually deliver. So you're beginning to see some changes, but I don't think we should leave it to the current government to implement the reforms. I think we should begin to advocate for wholesale change.
Another area of public spending that shocked me, when we had John Moynihan on, he educated me on this, is the debt repayment. This is an enormous, I think it's third in our top three of the public spending. I mean, what can we do about that?
I mean, the short answer is you can't really do much with the obligations that you've already got, because we heaven forbid that we ever become like Argentina, or I should say like Argentina was, and default on the debt. That really would be catastrophic. You need to honour your debts. A big part of the problem, and it's poorly understood even by financial journalists, is that under Gordon Brown and George Osborne, a lot of the bonds that were issued have variable interest rates. And as the interest rate, the official interest rate rises, the interest debt due on those bonds rises too. And that has been a really disastrous development, because that means that as interest rates go up, you get this sort of exponential increase in the amount of interest payments on the debt we have to make. But we need to honour those bonds. We need to make sure that we pay that debt. I think we need to look at what Elon Musk has been doing in America. Elon Musk is very worried about the debt in America, and he quite rightly sees it as an existential crisis. He realizes that historically great powers that have come a cropper have often come a cropper because they've lived beyond their means. The Habsburgs did this, the Dutch Republic did this, the Roman Empire actually did this. To avoid that fate, America has to close its $2 trillion a year deficit. And he's trying to do this by aggressively reducing spending. He's got it down by about 5% in a single year, which is fantastic, really, really good. If you can add a few more percentage points on that in years 2 and 3, you're really heading somewhere. So reduce the public spending and raise growth, economic growth. Now, if you can do that in America the way that Musk and Trump are doing it, you will eventually erode that $2 trillion deficit. It may take 15 years, it may take 20 years, it may take 30 years, but eventually the two lines will converge to the point where you return to having a surplus. Now, the United States hasn't had a surplus since, I think, 2001. Britain hasn't had a surplus for something like that. And we need to do something similar. We need to dramatically cut public spending, but also raise growth, and eventually the two lines will converge. I'm afraid you can't cancel the debts that were racked up by the Osborne, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, and worst of all, Boris Johnson disaster areas, but you can at least begin to close the gap.
One knock-on effect from these public spending changes you're talking about that probably everyone can be happy about is we should be paying less taxes, right?
Yeah, I'm in favour of paying less taxes. If you keep public spending at the level it is and cut taxes, I fear what you will do is you will increase debt, and your children and your grandchildren will just end up having to pay higher taxes and have a lower standard of living. So in Milestones, I budget, and forgive me, I don't have the figures in front of me, but I come up with a detailed plan to reduce public spending to allow you in the first year and then the first Parliament a degree of tax cuts, some tax cuts. it would have to be done gently and slowly, because as you're making these very difficult cuts in public spending, you're also going to have to increase spending on defence. And I think you've got to be honest about that. You've got to increase that from about 60 billion roughly to 80 billion roughly. And so in Milestones, there is some headroom for some cuts in tax. And I think roughly they should be as follows. You should remove, number one, the 45% income tax bracket, because reintroducing that, it'll be revenue neutral. If you abolish the 45% tax bracket, you actually change economic behaviour, so you generate more revenue to offset the reduction. So get rid of the 45% bracket. I think you then need to raise from roughly £52,000 a year to £57,000 a year the threshold for the 40% bracket. And you can do that in the first Parliament. Ultimately, you should aim over 2 or 3 parliaments to raise it to about 100,000. The effect of that means that you're basically left with a flat income tax. Most people in the country will pay a 20% income tax rate. I also come out with a budget that would allow you in the first Parliament to reduce corporation tax down to 15%. That is absolutely key. And to reduce VAT. VAT was introduced in Britain when Britain joined the European Union at 8%. It is now 20%. It is a ruinously high rate of taxation. I propose that over the first Parliament you reduce it from 20 to 15%, and I budget how to do this. If you reduce corporation tax and VAT, I suspect, and I wanted to be on the Conservative side, I suspect you will generate higher revenue, and then that extra revenue you can feed back into further reductions. The problem is it's very difficult to do it, but it has to be done. But you can only cut taxes if you bring public spending under control. So public spending reductions have to come first.
On this issue of people paying taxes, Britain's seeing many millionaires leave. I think we're second only to China in terms of the amount of millionaires leaving the country. I mean, what damage will that do?
I don't know if this is too obtuse a point to make, but when I was at university, I read a book by Ayn Rand called Atlas Shrugged. And for those of you not familiar with Atlas Shrugged, the novel is about America becoming essentially a socialist country and the entrepreneurial class giving up and going. And it tells you what happens when the creative types, I don't just mean the Elon Musks, but the Elon Musk in your office, the guy who goes the extra mile, the guy who risks stuff to do better. Yeah. When they give up and go, a society is doomed. And I fear that the brightest and the best in Britain will begin to, and are beginning to, leave. Now, some of the data is probably a multi-millionaire from some third world country deciding that they can reduce their tax bill by living in Monaco or Italy. Fine, great. But what I really fear is the 20-year-old. The 20-year-old in London who thinks, I'm not going to be able to afford a house. I'm not going to be able to afford a good quality of life. I'm going to spend essentially the first 5 months of the year working for my landlord, the next 4 months of the year working for the taxpayer, the taxman. I could move to the United States or I could move to Dubai and work for me. And you're already beginning to see that. And it's the 20-year-olds leaving that is so worrying. I noticed this in London from when I was last here. London, in my memory, was a place where there were lots of young people. And it was one of the joys as I went into middle age of wandering around London and seeing crowds of young people, rather like I was, who had clearly moved to London, not quite like Dick Whittington, but nonetheless they were seeking their fortune in London. They would be going out to bars and restaurants and clubs, so a bit of courtship going on, a bit of matchmaking. You don't sort of see that so much in London. Pubs are closed. Those people have gone. They're either moved out of London because they can't afford it, and I suspect some of them have left the country. London doesn't feel like a city of young English people coming to find their way in the world. It's like a giant airport lounge with people checking in with passports of convenience who have no civic loyalty to it. It has all the charm of an airport lounge. It's a catastrophe. This is our capital city. We need policies that make sure that London is a place where young English people can go and better their lives and start out in life and find a job and find a career and find a partner and live the English dream. It's like an airport lounge and people are checking out of it.
In Milestones, you also talk about defence and foreign policy. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, I mean, Britain is in a perilous condition. It has, in effect, 9 Royal Navy vessels. 2 of them are vast aircraft carriers, which I don't think any right-thinking admiral will dare take through the Straits of Hormuz because, you know, a $1 billion warship would be taken out by a $10,000 missile. We've got the equivalent of the perfect cavalry army in the age of the tanks. We don't really have a drone capacity, and yet we can see in conflicts around the world that drones are decisive. We've got the wrong equipment in the wrong place. We've spent the defence budget on what it suits the contractors to provide. So we need to do something about this, and we need to act, and we need to act quickly. I think, and I don't want to sound bellicose, but I think the United States has quite rightly recognized that the main threat to the world order comes from communist China. And the threat from communist China explains, and I'm sure Donald Trump would deny having anything in common with Joe Biden, but when Joe Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, to me the significance was not that he was pulling out of Afghanistan. It wasn't the disgraceful scenes we saw in Kabul. The significance of that move was that he was reorientating American policy to address the China question. We also, I think, see this with Donald Trump, a determination to address the China question. Clearly, Britain needs to wake up to the fact we live in a dangerous world. Our foreign policy outside the EU should be to be an ally of the United States and of the Anglosphere countries around the world. Anglosphere, I mean Australia and Canada and New Zealand. And other non-Anglosphere, I would say Western allies, Japan and others. But we need to be their allies, not by harking back to conflicts that we fought alongside each other in 60, 70, 80 years ago. We need to be able to deliver the hardware, and that means we need 4 divisions, which is what we had during the Cold War. We need 1 division capable of defending the British Isles. We need a 2nd division that is capable of expeditionary warfare alongside America, but that can deploy strength at force anywhere around the world as an ally of the United States. And we need 2 divisions for European defense as a deterrent against, I nearly said Soviet, Russian aggression. Maintaining 4 divisions means that we need to increase defense spending as a percentage of GDP to about 4%. But Poland is doing that, and you know, Poland perhaps lives in a more dangerous neighbourhood, and they've woken up to the dangers. But we need to match Poland. If we're going to be useful to Poland and America, we need to step up. I fear that the state of the British military is really quite shocking. I suspect that if there was a conflict and the British showed up at the moment, they would be rather like the Italians in the Second World War. They would be a net drain on their allies, a burden on their allies. We need to do this, and we need to do it pretty quickly. We need the ability to deploy force alongside the Americans, alongside our allies, if we want to live in a peaceful world, we need to have the ability to use lethal force. We live in a walled garden. We need to remember to maintain the wall.
So tying all of this together, the different threads of your milestones, I mean, how optimistic are you that we can move towards some of this?
The old country's not done yet. Britain has been in far worse positions. There's a malaise in this country, But think of what it would have been like in the 1970s, or worse, think of what it would have been like in this country in 1939, 1940. The country can get through this. The country can fix these problems. But it needs to wake up to the urgency and the change that's needed. There's a complacency about Britain. I grew up in a world in which people told me that our healthcare was the best in the world. I grew up in a world in which I was told our civil service were the best in the world. I was told that the BBC was the best in the world. One of the great things about living overseas is I've realized that none of that was true. Other countries have found better ways of doing things. And those myths we tell ourselves, we need to address. If we don't make the changes, we will go the way of many other countries which have discovered that modernity knocks on their door and it's very, very traumatic to their self-image. So we can salvage this situation, but it requires a fundamental change in the structure of the British state. I'll give you an example. In the late 19th century, or the mid-19th century, it became obvious to the elite in Japan that modernity was coming along and that they would be gobbled up by a Western power if they didn't change. Right. They had been a sleepy, self-contained island state doing their own thing for hundreds of years. And they had what was known as the Meiji Restoration. And it was a profound change in the way that the country was run. They basically got rid of an old elite and they intentionally went out there. They sent people to Prussia, they sent people to Britain, they sent people to America, and they looked around the world and they copied intentionally what was going on in other parts of the world. And it was a way of maintaining their status as an independent state. We needed a British equivalent to the Meiji Restoration. Not a revolution, but a restoration. We need profound changes to the British body politic. Otherwise, we will in effect be gobbled up. There's nothing inevitable about us being a top nation. We live with the liberties and the freedoms we have and take for granted because we were on the winning side and the right side. Good decisions taken by previous generations of Britons. I think the past generation of Britons has taken some disastrous decisions. So we need to make some profound changes. If we do that, we can fix this problem. If we carry on the way we have for the past 30 years, then the best we can aim for is that America will come to our rescue again. And I don't think that's good enough.
Douglas Carswell, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.